This is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Israel Halperin, sports scientist, researcher, and combat sports coach from Tel Aviv. Hi everyone, welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Israel Halperin. As you will hear, Israel has made a very interesting transition from professional athlete to coach to researcher. He received his PhD at AIS in Australia and has done research in a variety of different areas. In the interview, we discussed the use of focus of attention cues, the role of athlete autonomy in training programs, how S&C and Skill Act can better support each other, and how to improve the research methods we are using in motor learning. Hope you enjoy.
Not 10 years ago, I was a child. I was a good boy and you let me go. Now I'm on a talk show. Today my guest is Israel Halperin, sports scientist and coach in Tel Aviv. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Israel.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to chatting with you.
Great. And to kick things off, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I like to tell the listeners about me. I've got three phases in my life. One, that I was an athlete up until I would say my mid-20s. I was a competitive combat athlete. So I competed even professionally at kickboxing, Thai boxing, and mixed martial arts. I traveled the world. I lived 2 years in Los Angeles training with a professional team. And then I spent a year in Thailand. I traveled Europe and I competed in all these places, and I've gained a lot of interest and insights for how different gyms coach and how there's a lot of cultural aspects to it. After I retired, I gravitated towards coaching. I'm still a kickboxing coach mainly, so I work with a lot of athletes who compete in boxing, kickboxing, and MMA. And then I'm also a strength and conditioning coach. And that was this was the second phase, the coaching. And then the third one is just the academic phase. So I completed my bachelor's in physical education in Israel, in Tel Aviv. I then moved to Canada, to Newfoundland, and I completed my master's in exercise physiology. And there I looked into topics concerning muscle fatigue. For example, what happens when I fatigue one side of the body? How will that influence the other side that is rested? So that's a topic that we looked deeply into, called non-local muscle fatigue. And then I had a unique opportunity to move to Australia and complete a PhD there at the Australian Institute of Sport. So back then they were looking to strengthen the Australian Combat Centre. So that was a facility that was developed to enhance the success rate of the 4 Olympic combat sports, including taekwondo, judo, wrestling, and boxing. So I worked there for 3 years, assisting the athletes in any way I can, coaching a little bit, advice, testing, all these things, just acting as a sports scientist, all while completing my PhD, which I dealt with a different topic completely than what I've done during my master's. And this is, I would say, motor learning, and more specifically, just the effects that different types of feedback and instructions and practice conditions had on the performance of mostly elite level combat athletes. And then I should add that I completed another year of a postdoc in Canada, again in Newfoundland, and now I'm back in Tel Aviv.
Oh, that's great. That's a really interesting career path, and I definitely want to dive into some of the, how they relate and what you've learned over the years. But so to kick things off, though, I thought I would start with something near and dear to my heart that you've looked at is focus of attention, kind of cueing and instructions, and particularly you've looked at it in combat sports. So can you tell us a little bit about what you found in terms of what coaches actually use and what might be the best thing to use?
Right. So during my competitive career as well as my coaching career, I always noticed that the feedback or instructions, or however you want to call it, that I received from my coaches or I provide to my athletes as a coach had a considerable influence on me and the athletes. And that's always something I wanted to look into. And then I ran into Gabriella Wolf's work that mainly looked in the effects of attentional focus, external versus internal, and so on and so forth. And I said, wow, this is great. I got to look into that with the combat stuff because there's nothing onto it really. So when I moved into Australia, I had a unique opportunity to just fly to the nationals, the national boxing championships. And I was, it wasn't my idea. I wish it was mine, but it was my supervisor's idea. His name is David Martin. He's right now with the 76ers, actually, acting as a sports scientist over there. And he told me, let's just record what the coaches say. And I was like, oh, how are we going to do that? Who's going to agree to participate? I was stressed about the idea, but I said, let's do it. So I just went, I flew to, I forgot where it was, maybe Brisbane, I think. Mm-hmm. And I flew over there just with 2 recorders. And that was just the whole equipment. And then I approached all the coaches there and I told them, listen, guys, we're doing an experiment. Would you mind if I attach the recorder to your shirts as you're coaching the athletes during the bouts? And I thought to myself as a coach, like, oh, who's going to agree to that? That might confuse them. And that was one of the most important championships, right? Because that was before the Rio Olympics. Mm-hmm. But surprisingly, most of the coaches agreed, which was amazing. So I was able to record the feedback that was provided during, I think it was 26 bouts. 26 bouts. So what we've done is we just recorded the feedback or the instructions or anything essentially that they told their athletes between the rounds. Mm-hmm. And we got a whole lot of feedback statements. And fortunately, Gabriella helped me analyze the data because I was relatively new to this topic. And we decided to analyze it in view of her optimal model. And what I can tell you is, just going back to the attentional focus, is that most of the feedback was neutral. In that regard, that it wasn't directing the athlete's attention internally or externally. It was just neutral. But out of the 2, they mostly use internal focus instructions. And what was more interesting is the bouts that were lost, the coaches provided considerably more. I think it was 8% more internal instructions compared to the winning bouts. Now, of course, we're not establishing any causal relationship here, but nevertheless, this was an interesting finding. So what I've done after that, I just wanted to see what happens in an experiment. So we have this a punching integrator in the Australian Institute of Sport, which is just this essentially a punching bag that is just attached to the wall that you can punch it, and then it accurately measures punching forces and velocity prior to impact. And then what we've done is just took the instructions that the coaches provided or mostly provided during the bouts that we recorded and just provided them with the same common types of external, internal, and neutral instructions as they punched the punching integrator in a number of punches. So straight punches and punches from the side or hooks. And we had a sample that included both elite level that was defined with having above, I think it was 5 international bouts and over 25 bouts overall. So highly competitive. And for this operation, we just defined them as elite. I mean, this is a topic that is not easy to come to terms of what is defined as elite. But for the sake of the study, we defined them as elite. And another sample that was a sub-elite. So they're all competitive, but in a national level. And they had under, I think it was 10 bouts. So they still train quite hard and they have high ambitions, but they're just on a different level. And irrespective of the level, all athletes, I suppose at this point it's not too surprising, given all the literature that exists on this topic, but when we ask them to focus on punching the pad as hard and as fast as they could, external instructions, they punch considerably harder and faster compared to the internal instructions, which were focused on moving your arm as fast and forcefully as you possibly can. And the external instructions also led to better performance compared to the neutral instructions, which were just punch as hard and as fast as you can. So in that regard, we weren't directing their attention either internally or externally.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And going back to the coaches, did you get a feel for why, is it a lack of knowing the research area or do they actually kind of prefer the internal cues? Did you get a feel for why there's kind of this preponderance of use despite this, all of Gabby's work for a lot of years? Yeah. That's
an excellent question. And as we know, there's that's a different topic that I'm deeply interested in is the gap between science and practice. And coaches, for the most part, just are completely unaware, or at least in Australia, they were unaware, because I did my best to inform them. And what I found too is, in contrast to some of the other sports science topics, most of them were very receptive to this kind of this research theme of instructions and cues, even though to a lot of people this is very counterintuitive. If you ask a person, based on my experience, what would they think would lead to better performance or learning, based on my experience, most people would say internal instructions. So they're just, for the most part, they're just unaware.
Yeah, and I've very anecdotally found the same thing that you have in terms of the amount of internal. But I really like in your study you related it to the success in the match. That was a really nice twist. I know another thing, that you've studied, and this also fits in with the optimal model, is the role of autonomy in training programs. So can you tell us a little bit of the work you've done there? Yeah.
This is another great variable that I personally, as a coach, I love it so much, and I implement it as much as I can, even before I knew of its existence as an independent theme of research. So as a coach, I always thought to myself, now going back a few years before I started looking into the research, is that providing athletes with a choice, to me, just made perfect sense, because at the end of the day, we are shooting in the dark as coaches. We don't really know if what we're doing is necessarily the optimal path for a given athletes. We estimate. And therefore, and because of that, to me, trying to gather feedback or involve the athlete in the decision-making process just makes perfect sense, assuming that they're a responsible athlete that wants the best for themselves. So to me, what the athlete has to say, or what she thinks that we should do next, I value that, and I always put a lot of weight into their opinions, and therefore encourage them to make choices. So I try to work with them eye to eye rather than tell them what to do. Just because I don't really think I have all the answers, and working together is always what I strive to do. And then when I started looking into the research, I was so pleased. I was like, yeah, this is exactly what I believe in. And then there's research on it. How cool is that? Yeah, what I noticed, that the research that I've looked into back then, coming from the motor learning world, my impression was that the outcome measures are usually not related to athletics. So it's just a lot of throwing tasks or balance tasks. So I wouldn't be able to generalize that to explosive full body activities such as punching or jumping. So I thought there's room to try to replicate and see whether these effects generalize when we change the outcome measures. Yeah. So one study that I've done, to my knowledge, perhaps it's the first one that looked into the effects of choice on just explosive performance measures of athletes. Essentially, we had a case study with a world champion kickboxer, and then we replicated the study with I think it was 13 competitive kickboxers, but we'll call them intermediate level. And we had them punch that punching integrator, the one I described previously that we had in the AIS, on one condition. That all happened in the same day. So this was a within subject design. So on the same day, participants did both conditions, and then they repeated them a number of times on different days. And of course, the order was counterbalanced. So in one condition, the order of the delivered punches was constant. We told them how to punch. So first, we would tell them you punch 3 times with your lead straight. Following that, you'd punch 3 straight rare punches with your backhand. And then you're going to throw, and so on and so forth. So we dictated the order of punches to them. And this, by the way, is a routine that we constantly implemented as part of regular testing at the AIS. And then the other round, which was, we called it the choice round, we told them, listen, you're going to deliver the exact same number of punches. And every punch, again, has to be delivered with as much force and velocity as you can possibly produce. But we'll leave the order up to you. So you can start with the left hook or the rear hook. It's up to you. At the end of the day, you're still going to deliver the same number of punches, but the order is up to you. And I should add that a combination is impossible. So they wouldn't be able to deliver the punches in a combination. Every punch was single output. So there's about 7 seconds of rest between each punch. So there's no combination here that could explain the effects.
Okay.
And the protocol is not fatiguing at all. And the athletes know that, they're very competitive and motivated, and they know that they're evaluated. So I highly doubt that motivation is a factor here. Yet despite all of that, the athletes punched faster and harder in the choice condition, irrespective of their level. Well, the case study, it was just one case, but nevertheless, over 6 testing days, he punched harder and or faster under the choice condition compared to the control condition. Now, the effects with this guy were actually quite large, but with the other group, we still found consistent effects that were meaningful. So when we let them make a choice, they just punched harder. So I was like, oh, this makes perfect sense to me. And again, the effects that we found were quite large. They're consistent with, I would say, something equivalent to an intervention of a few weeks or even month of resistance training. Because, punching 6% with greater forces, that's very meaningful. Mm-hmm. And that's all to just an intervention that allowed them to make a choice as to the practice conditions.
Yeah, no, that's really great. I like that. And I think the point you're trying to emphasize is a really important one, right? You're trying to say there wasn't really any strategical advantage to reordering the punches or anything. It's just the pure ability to choose that's kind of causing the effect, right?
Yeah, we're able to, I think at least, that we're able to extract that only, to isolate that intervention. And I don't think there's any other ways to explain the effects.
Yeah. I know that's consistent with kind of more basic motor learning tasks. Like if you give people the choice of a color of a thing they use, which is completely irrelevant to the task, they do better as well. So I think that's really interesting stuff. And I think it's good to see more of that to being studied.
I encourage coaches that I work with to implement that as a strategy. It's backed up by research, and I think it also makes sense, just if you even put the research aside, is just to involve the athlete, just have them be more accountable and involved in a procedure. I think from a basic psychological point of view, it makes perfect sense. And based on my experience and working with athletes, it's not always easy because sometimes they're used to being told what to do, and they're like soldiers, just going over the orders. But I personally always try to break that pattern and ask them, what do you think we should do? What do you believe? Do you prefer doing one exercise before the next? And I think that it's very important to avoid strawman arguments when it comes to that, because sometimes I've heard people tell me, it's like, well, yeah, of course, but we can't let the athletes choose everything. And I fully agree with that. I don't think the athletes should choose everything to do with a program, but providing them with some choices, even irrelevant ones, like you said, with the color of a ball that is completely irrelevant. Start slow with the choices that you provide and gradually increase the degree of choice that you provide them. This is a strategy, at least, that I use, and I think successfully so.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. Yeah. And so next I wanted to go back to something, which you mentioned at the start about your background. And, you started in, more strength conditioning area and then kind of transitioned into skill acquisition and motor learning. So I wanted to get your thoughts. This is something I've been interested in, how did switching, to another area change your view? And how do you think these, strength and conditioning and skill act can support each other better?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And in recent years, I've been so impressed ever since I was exposed to this type of literature. And it takes a while, at least based on my experience, to wrap your head around some of the concepts from motor learning and skill acquisition. And to this day, some of it is still above me. It's like, oh man, the theory is so complex and rich and deep. So it took me a while, but man, do I ever believe that the literature and the concepts and the applied concepts coming out of the skill acquisition is just so extremely relevant to both sports coaches, perhaps even more so than anyone else. Just the technical coaches, they can benefit so much. This is where the big money is at, I believe. But also strength and conditioning coaches can benefit so much from understanding, for example, reading about the effects of different instructions and feedback and practice conditions. And not to mention that based on my experience, coaches are actually quite receptive to hearing these things out because they don't require expensive technologies for the most part. They're just things that a lot of coaches can relate to. I do find that there is some sort of a gap. It's people like yourself are doing such an incredible job for the profession and trying to bridge the gap now between, let's call it skill acquisition professionals and perhaps strength and conditioning professionals or just sports science. but the link is so important. Again, looking at myself as someone who somewhat transitioned from traditional sports science more into motor learning and skill acquisition, I've gained so much. And speaking from a kickboxing coach, I've gained so much from it, and I think the athletes have as well. Some of the concepts, just random versus block, implicit, explicit, whole versus part, all of these things are just so beneficial and useful, and it can be acted upon immediately. And then they, for the most part, don't even require expensive equipment. So yeah, I encourage anyone who's listening who doesn't have a strong background in motor learning and comes more from a strength and conditioning background, guys, you don't know what you're missing. It's just this huge world over there that we can leverage upon it, and everybody will benefit. So, perhaps one thing that I have noticed, and I could be wrong, and I'd love for you to correct me if you think that I am, many of the studies in motor learning, the outcome measures that they use are just a lot of the times just not relevant to sports science or applied sports sciences with the examples I provided. So tossing tasks or some of the balance tasks, usually with untrained participants, sometimes that's like a strength and conditioning coach might read it and think, well, you know what, I'm not sure that this is relevant to what I do. Yeah. So yeah, I think, so what are your thoughts on this?
No, I agree completely with you. There's so much of the motor learning literature is, single degree of freedom movements of, key pressing or, simple tasks. And instead, in trying to scale that up to multiple degree of freedom coordination tasks like in your sports, it's a big leap, right? And I think some of the things that you're doing where you're trying to replicate or test the same is really important, because it's not necessarily the case that it's going to. And I think it helps to convince people when you do actually make the connection using a more realistic sporting task than a simple lab task. Definitely.
The problem is that it's just so difficult coming up with ways to, especially measure learning.
Yeah.
It's like I thought about it for so long with the combat athletes, and it's like I don't know.
Yeah.
So we just measure performance, and this is a limitation, but nevertheless, I would still take that over nothing,
Yeah. No, I agree completely, and I understand why people use these simple tasks. You're right; they're so easy to get measures, and the variability. The thing I discovered too, when you try to use real movements in the lab, your variability is enormous, and to try to get consistent measures, and it makes everything harder. But we need to do it, though. Definitely, I agree.
Yeah. I don't know what the solution is. I mean, I'm struggling with myself, but I do know that this could partly explain some of the gap, why perhaps motor learning and skill acquisition is not as popular as it should be.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree completely. I think that is an issue. And another area that I've seen you do some work in that I think kind of relates to this is one that's kind of, in a broader across all of science now, is the issues of kind of reliability and validity in research and practice in what we're doing, and kind of taking stock of what's going on. So can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing there?
Yeah. This is, honestly, this is now my favorite topic. Just, the problems that we as a field, so broadly speaking, sports science, and I suppose under it, motor learning and sports psychology, I suppose so many fields just fall under this problem right now with just research methodology. And I've spent a lot of time reading about what happens in different professions, mainly medicine and psychology, with a replication crisis, how some of these fields have attempted to replicate some of their studies, which was such an impressive attempt, right? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, a lot of the studies were not able to be were not replicated. So that's why we're living in what has been loosely defined, I suppose, as the replication crisis. Mm-hmm. And there's so much interesting things happening right now that I think if we'll look back in this period in the past, 5-7 years, it'll be remembered as a vital point. At least I hope so, mm-hmm. because so many interesting things are appearing in terms of how we can improve our statistics, our methodology, our science, generally speaking. And I read it with so much passion, and I was thinking to myself, well, maybe we should try to see whether we can borrow some of the concepts and just apply them into exercise science or sports science, which is what I've attempted to do and still attempt to do. I published a few papers on this topic, but we do face a lot of problems, and especially our field, we have very limited funds, it's very difficult to recruit participants, especially for long-term studies. We can't pay the subjects. It's very hard for us to access athletes. So we are confronting a real problem, and it's not clear how to solve it. But at the end of the day, the way I see it, at least with applied sports science, our goal should be to assist athletes and coaches do a better job. And it's not always easy if we can't replicate what they're doing with studies that are just too far removed from what actually happens in real life. So there's always that external validity question and how we can improve upon that. So these are topics that I struggle with, and I try to, sometimes I succeed, mostly I don't, try to come up with possible solutions that can enhance the way we do science as a field.
Yeah, no, I think it is. It's the same for me. It's not one of my favorites, like a cold bucket of water on things, but it is really, really important. And I think I like what you seem to be doing. I don't know if this is deliberate, but you're right. In our area, we can't always do a super high-powered study of of elite athletes. It's impossible. So I like what you're kind of doing. I call it a triangulation approach, where you're doing mixing field studies with case studies with, when you have a chance, get in an experimental study. So I think that's a really good way to do it. And what we need more of those other things, I think, than
exactly.
Really
that's the key point. Mm-hmm. That's the key point, because I think we as a field overly focus on just completing very tightly controlled, randomized controlled trials. And this again, I think this is commendable. This is so impressive. But if we look reality in the eyes, it's very difficult for us to recruit an adequate sample. So typically our studies are undersampled, and then they're usually shorter in duration and very narrow in terms of the inclusion criteria, just because we try to reduce the variability. And then the studies are just become, just generalizing from these studies becomes difficult. So instead, we should try to leverage upon all the different study designs that are out there: case studies, prospective studies, observational studies, quasi-experiments. And I think we don't see them as much, and we can leverage off them, especially as like, let's call it the totality of evidence. Because when we put everything together, some study designs have limitations and others have strength. But if we put them all together in an attempt to better understand a phenomena and improve practice, I think that's the way to go. So yeah, put it, that's a perfect way of saying it.
Yeah. No, I definitely, I'm hoping that we'll get more of those and get more accepted. It seems like it's happening, but it does take a while. Yeah.
I am actually quite optimistic about this. I mean, it will take time, obviously, because things take time, but the direction seems positive even within our fields. I see it.
Yeah.
I think so.
I agree too. Another thing I wanted to give you a chance to mention was I've seen that you've recently taken the plunge into podcasting yourself with I think you call it the Complementary Training Podcast. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with that?
Yeah, my good friend Mladen and we've been he's also a sports scientist, and we've been good friends for a number of years, and we talk on Skype every few weeks. It's been like that for years, and our chats always last hours. And then at the end of them, we're like, oh man, we should have recorded it. Somebody might have benefited from listening to it. So let's just do it. Let's just record our chats and just put it out there. People might find some benefit in it. And both of us, I think, are big believers in just dealing with uncertainty and looking it straight in the eyes and making decisions from a state of uncertainty, knowing that we don't know everything. And we always somehow in our chats, it always boils down to the fact that we know very little, and it's fine to admit it, and it's fine to acknowledging it. So we called the podcast Training Chats. Mm-hmm. And so far we've been talking about just all kind of different aspects related to coaching. We haven't touched motor learning yet, but I'm sure that will pop up soon. And that's what we've been doing. We had already a few episodes and getting reasonable feedback from it. So we hope to continue doing it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I listened to some of that, and it is really good. I think you're right. Exactly. Those kind of conversations are good for other people to hear. And you're right. You're very open about kind of limitations and, things we need to take into account in the field. So I think that's really good.
Thank you.
I guess the last question I have for you is, to tell us a little bit of kind of what you're currently working on or your near future plans.
Well, you see, I just go where my passion lies, and I think for better and for worse, it changes a lot. So I think I'm a pretty reasonable generalist. I have reasonable amount of knowledge on various topics, but I wouldn't define myself as a specialist in any one of them. Mm-hmm. So right now I'm very interested in just methodology. I read a lot about it. I write papers on it, and now I've started to actually conduct a few experiments. Up until now it was just mainly review papers. Now I've started to run some experiments. So that's what I'm working on. Or for example, one project I'm working on is how we as exercise scientists interpret statistics, p-values, and the dreaded p-values. So do we have a good appreciation of it as a field? So that's a project I've taken on right now. And currently I'm working on other projects, one to do with music, some foam rolling. So I'm still all over the place, and I love it. I hope that the system will allow me to continue spreading my interest in different directions and just see what happens. And of course, I try to keep, a goal of mine that I'm not sure how feasible it is if I want to continue pursuing an academic career is to always dedicate between 10 or even 20% of my time to coaching, just because I feel it makes me a better scientist, at least an applied exercise scientist. So I try to do that, but it is becoming more and more difficult.
Yeah, no, I bet. And then that sounds like a really good approach. Ambitious one, but really, really good. So yeah. This was great. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Israel.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Israel. You can find out more about Israel from the links I've posted in the show notes, and I definitely encourage you to check out his Training Chats podcast. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials including an extra monthly episode and written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.
If tears were liquor